The morning room at Ashmore Park had been stripped of its warmth. The blue silk curtains that Cecily had chosen in the first year of her marriage were gone now, replaced with serviceable gray wool that let in a thin November light without any of its warmth. The looking glass above the chimney-piece had been covered with a cloth, as though someone were afraid of what it might reflect. The small rosewood writing desk in the corner was the only thing that remained precisely where she had placed it, and Cecily sat before it with her hands folded in her lap, not touching it, not yet. Mrs. Pell stood near the doorway with a cup of tea going cold on a tray, watching Cecily with the patient, measuring look of someone paid to watch. "Her Grace has been very quiet this morning," she said, to no one in particular. "She is not herself today." Cecily heard this. She had long since stopped registering it as an insult. She turned her face toward the window and looked out at the park where the last of the autumn leaves moved in a slow, deliberate pattern across the gravel path, as though even the trees were uncertain where to settle. She pressed one fingertip to the small brass lock at the face of the writing desk and felt the cold of the metal travel up through her glove. The trustee was expected before noon. She thought about the key. It hung on its ribbon beneath the high collar of her gown, resting against her sternum, and she had worn it there every day for 11 months, without anyone knowing it was there, without anyone thinking to look. This was, she understood, their mistake and not hers. Her name was Cecily Ann Ashmore, Duchess of Ashmore, by her marriage to the late Francis Peregrine Ashmore, who had died of a fever in January and left behind him a title, an entail, an estate of 12,000 acres in 3 counties, and a wife whom his family had decided, within 6 weeks of the funeral, was not capable of managing her own affairs. She had been 26 years old when they began. She was 27 now, and she still sat in her own morning room, and the desk was still locked, and she was still waiting. Francis had been the only person who had known her fully, and he was gone. That was the truth of it. Not that she was unwell. Not that her mind had softened or her temperament turned erratic. Those were the words his mother had used in the petition to the court, along with phrases supplied by a physician Cecily had met only once, for 20 minutes, in a room where she had been told she was simply being assessed for her general health after a difficult bereavement. She had not known what she was consenting to when she sat down and answered his questions politely. She had not known until the petition arrived. Francis had known his family. In the last months of his illness, he had written to her daily, letters that piled on her writing desk, and that she had read and answered and folded and placed back inside their envelopes with a careful hand, because they were the only living thing left of him. The letters were still there, inside the locked desk. All of them. 43 letters in his handwriting, and one more, the one she had discovered only 3 weeks after his death, folded inside the last envelope he had sent before the fever took him, the one she had not been able to open until she was certain she could read it, without coming apart. She had read it. She had understood what it contained. She had locked it inside the desk and worn the key against her skin ever since, because she had known even in grief that the letter would only matter when there was someone in the room willing to hear what it said. The question she had spent 11 months asking was whether that person would ever come. She heard the sound of a carriage on the gravel below, and she straightened her spine, and she folded her hands again in her lap, and she waited. Edmund Hartley, Earl of Kinvale, was not what Cecily had expected. She had expected a solicitor's surrogate, someone with ink-stained fingers and a look of preemptive apology, someone who would address the top of her head rather than her face, and speak in the careful, slightly elevated tone people used when they believed they were managing the disordered. What entered the morning room instead was a man of perhaps 34 years, tall, broad across the shoulders, in a perfectly fitted navy coat and cream breeches that had seen hard riding to get here, with a face that was still and watchful and carried a scar through the left brow that had turned silver with age. His eyes were gray and moved across the room with a precise attention that landed, finally, on her. He did not address the top of her head. He met her eyes. "Your Grace," he said, and the words were level and neither apologetic nor elevated. "I am Edmund Hartley, Earl of Kinvale. I have been appointed by the court as trustee over the management of the Ashmore estates during the period of assessment. I am aware that you have not been informed of my specific identity before today, and I regret the discourtesy." Cecily looked at him for a moment. He was the first person outside her own household who had used the word discourtesy in her presence in 11 months. "You are on time," she said. "That is something." A muscle moved at the corner of his jaw. He sat down, when she indicated the chair opposite her, and she noticed that he sat as a man sits who has learned to hold himself still, not as a man who is naturally at ease. Gerald Ashmore arrived before the tea was poured. He came in from the corridor without knocking, as he had taken to doing since January, and he brought with him his usual expression, that practiced combination of fraternal concern and barely contained eagerness that Cecily had learned to read in the first week. "Kinevale," he said, shaking Edmund's hand with something like relief. "Good of you to come quickly. I want you to understand that we are not unkind people. We are simply concerned for my sister-in-law's welfare." He glanced at Cecily briefly, with a look that was almost regretful. "She has been through a great deal. She is not herself, as you can see." Cecily poured tea and said nothing, because she had learned that silence was more honest than the response she wished to give. Edmund took the cup from her hand and looked at her steadily for a moment before he answered Gerald. "I have not yet formed an assessment," he said. "That is, in fact, why I have come." She saw Gerald's expression shift very slightly, just enough to notice. She filed it away and kept her hands steady on the teapot. Edmund was thorough. That was the first thing she learned about him. He did not accept the family's version of events as a complete record, and he read carefully everything he was given, rather than accepting a summary. She had not expected this. She had expected the machinery to run its course as machinery does, and to produce the outcome that had been purchased for it. And she had been preparing herself for that outcome, with a quiet, determined grief. Edmund moved through the house without deference to Gerald's preferences for which room she should be excluded from, and on the third morning she found him in the library, at 7 a.m, before anyone else had come downstairs, reviewing the estate accounts from the previous 3 years. She did not announce herself. She simply sat down at the opposite end of the table and opened the accounts ledger from the year before Francis died, because she needed to cross-reference a figure and because it was her library, and she had not stopped requiring the use of her own house simply because someone had decided she should not be trusted with it. Edmund looked up. He did not ask what she was doing. He went back to his page. 20 minutes later, he said without looking up. The quarterly payment to the Ashmore School in Keeling Village was halted in March. "It was halted by Gerald's instruction," she said. "The school has been operating on the interest from a private endowment I made before the petition was filed, which he cannot touch. I have been maintaining the accounts myself." Edmund looked up. Then, not in surprise. Exactly. In something closer to a man revising a set of assumptions he had not known he was carrying. "Who has been keeping these figures?" he asked. "I have," she said. He looked down again. She watched the stillness at the corner of his jaw and could not read it, and returned to her own ledger. That afternoon she was in the garden with Alice, the cook's daughter, who was 8 years old and had developed the habit of following the Duchess at a respectful distance during her daily walks, not speaking, simply keeping her company with the dignified seriousness of childhood. Cecily had begun bringing a book, and Alice had begun bringing a doll she was teaching to read, and they had spent many afternoons this way without requiring anything of each other. It was one of the only hours of the day when no one watched Cecily for signs of deterioration. She heard the crunch of gravel behind her and felt, before she turned, the particular quality of attention that had no rational name. Edmund had come out onto the terrace. He was not looking at her with the physician's measuring look. He was not looking at her the way Gerald looked, with that prepared concern that was really a kind of assessment of distance. He was looking at her the way you look at something you have unexpectedly understood, and did not expect to understand and are not certain yet how to account for. Alice said in her serious way, "Is that the new gentleman?" "He is," Cecily said. "He looks sad," Alice said. Cecily looked down at the child's face, at the unsentimental accuracy of 8 years old, and thought that of all the observations she had heard made in the last 11 months, this one had the most to recommend it for honesty. "I believe he may be," she said. "Why?" Alice asked. "I do not know yet," Cecily said. Alice considered this for a moment, and then returned to her doll, apparently satisfied that not knowing yet was an acceptable answer. Cecily turned back to the garden and did not answer further, because the child was more perceptive than most adults she knew, and she had no comfort to offer in either direction, and because she found, standing in the late afternoon with the gravel path going gold in the November light, that she was more curious than she had intended to be. That evening Edmund asked her very quietly how long she had been managing the school accounts herself. She told him 14 months, since before Frances had become fully ill. He wrote something in his small notebook and said nothing more. She noticed, however, that at dinner he sat across from her, rather than at the head of the table where Gerald had directed the footman to place him, and that when Gerald began a sentence with the phrase, "Given my sister-in-law's limitations," Edmund said, without looking up from his wine, "I should be grateful if you would let me form my own observations." Lord Ashmore. Gerald did not finish his sentence. Cecily looked at her plate and allowed herself, very quietly, the smallest measure of something she had not felt in a long time. Not hope. She was too careful for hope. Something more like attention. She did not notice, not immediately, that she had stopped holding her breath, close. If someone had told him 6 months ago that he would travel to Ashmore Park, expecting to manage a woman of shattered faculties and find instead someone who corrected a steward's arithmetic error without ceremony, and sat with a child in a garden without needing to be admired for it, he had read the petition. He had read the physician's certificate. He had read the family's testimonies, carefully composed and internally consistent, and he had read all of it with the trained attention of a man who had spent 15 years in legal administration. And he had believed what was written because the machinery of it was so familiar, so well assembled, so convincing in every technical requirement. He had signed the order for trusteeship in February. He had not been in the room with her when he signed it. He had been in his office in London, reading a document prepared by other people. And he had signed it the way you sign the thing that seems to be obviously and unfortunately necessary. The way you sign it when you believe you are protecting someone. He understood, by the end of his first week at Ashmore Park, that he had not protected her. He had added one more instrument to the machinery that was pressing against her, and he had done it without once asking to meet her, and this understanding settled in him with a weight that had no name, that was not the word guilt. He had been here before, not at Ashmore Park, not with Cecily. Here, precisely, with the particular feeling of arriving too late, of believing a version of events that had been constructed rather than lived, of signing a thing that could not be unsigned. His wife, Eleanor, had been 29 years old when her own family had decided she was unwell. She had died at 31, in a house in the country where she had been sent to recover, and he had not known how to save her in time, because he had spent a year and a half believing the family's version of events. He had been 27 years old. He had believed the people he was supposed to trust. He had been wrong, and the wrongness of it had not stopped being heavy simply because time had passed. He sat with this knowledge in his rooms at Ashmore Park, and understood that he could either continue to be the instrument of someone else's argument, or he could look at what was actually in front of him. What was in front of him was a woman who managed 14,000 acres of accounts without error, who spoke with precise care to a child in a garden, who told difficult truths to her steward without cruelty, and who sat each morning before a locked rosewood writing desk with her hands perfectly folded, as though she were waiting for something she believed might not come in time. He had noticed the desk on the first day. He had noticed she never opened it when anyone was watching. He had noticed the narrow black ribbon at her throat, and the small weight that sometimes pressed against the muslin of her collar when she leaned forward. And he had wondered, with a gathering attention he did not yet permit himself to name, what she was keeping. He asked her nothing directly. He was not yet the right man to ask her anything directly. But he moved himself, very deliberately, to the near side of whatever was coming. He told Gerald in the library on Thursday that the guardianship petition would require corroboration beyond the family's own testimony. He told the estate steward that Her Grace's directives regarding the home farm should be followed as given. He told Mrs. Pell with a quiet precision that made her take a step back that he would not require her daily reports on the Duchess's habits. He did not tell Cecily any of this. He simply did it. She noticed. He could tell by the way she sat at dinner, not more relaxed. Exactly, but something less armored, as though she had calculated that the next blow might not come from his direction, and had adjusted her weight accordingly. He understood for the first time in 11 months what the desk was for. Not what it contained, what it was for, precisely. She was keeping something safe until someone came who was capable of hearing what it held. He was not certain yet that he was that person. He had signed the paper. He was not certain that could be forgiven. What he was certain of was that she was sane. She had been sane all along. And the machinery that had said otherwise was going to require disassembly, and he was the only person in the house with both the authority and the growing inclination to disassemble it. The letter arrived on a Tuesday, 6 days into Edmund's residence at Ashmore Park. Cecily did not see it arrive. She learned of its contents from Bridget, her maid, who came upstairs with the morning water, and a low, frightened voice, and said that the footman in the hall had told the kitchen that a new physician's certificate had been delivered from London, signed by a Dr. Morris, and that Lord Ashmore had been heard to say that arrangements were being made. She has not improved, Gerald had told the solicitor in the hall, and Bridget had heard it from the kitchen maid, and the kitchen maid had repeated it word for word in the back passage. She is not herself. She never has been. Not really. Not since before. Francis, we are simply doing what must be done. Cecily sat on the edge of her bed and heard Bridget's account and felt the cold of it settle from her throat. Downward, the slow, specific cold of a thing that has been feared for so long, it has almost become familiar. They were going to move her to a house in the country. Not Ashmore Park, which was the country, but a smaller house, a house where the management of her affairs could be taken up more formally, where the fiction of her incapacity could be rendered into legal fact by the combined weight of 2 physicians' certificates and a trustee's concurrence. That last part was the thing she could not yet determine. Edmund had said nothing to her about the letter. He had not told her it was coming. She did not know whether his silence was the silence of a man who had not been told, or the silence of a man who already knew and had decided. She had believed, cautiously, that he was different from the others. She had allowed herself in small and carefully controlled increments to begin to trust the way he moved through the house without joining Gerald's conclusions. She had watched him correct the steward with the quiet authority of someone who intended to get things right, rather than someone who needed to appear to get things right, and she had felt the first stirring of something she could not safely name. Perhaps she had been wrong. Perhaps she had simply been desperate for someone in the machinery who was not grinding her down, and she had made Edmund into that person because she needed him to be, and he was not. The key was cold through the ribbon. She pressed it once with her fingers through the muslin, and then folded her hands in her lap and made herself think. The letters were in the desk. They had always been in the desk. Francis had written to her in his own hand, and the letters contained his mind, his care, his exact and particular perception of who she was. And those letters would show anyone willing to read them what kind of woman he had believed her to be. Not unwell, not fragile, not herself in the way Mrs. Pell meant the phrase herself, entirely and specifically and beyond any argument. And the last letter, the one he had written to Edmund, she had kept it because she had believed the moment would come. She had believed it because Francis had believed it, and he had been right about most things, and she was not willing to abandon the last piece of his judgment simply because the machinery had grown louder. She stood up from the edge of the bed and went to the writing desk, and stood before it for a long moment in the gray November light of the morning room. She reached into the collar of her gown and drew out the key. She had not unlocked the desk since March, and the lock was stiff, and she felt the resistance of it as a kind of answer to the question she had been asking herself all morning, which was whether she was ready to do this alone or whether she was still waiting for someone else to make it safe. The lock turned. The desk opened. The smell of the letters came up at her like a hand, the specific smell of paper and ink and his writing, Francis's writing, and she pressed her lips together and breathed once through her nose, and then began. She read the last letter through first, because she needed to be certain it still said what she remembered. It did. She read it again more slowly, noting each specific sentence, the date in the upper corner, the particular formality of his legal phrasing giving way, at the close, to the plain language of a man who is afraid of running out of time. He had written to the Earl of Kinvale, whom he had known since school, whose judgment he had trusted above all others in matters requiring both legal precision and human conscience. He had written that he feared his family would move against his wife after his death, not out of cruelty, but out of the specific conviction of people who had never encountered a woman who thought the way Cecily thought, who had mistaken her precision for coldness and her composure for absence. He had written that he was asking Edmund, specifically as the one man he trusted, to come if called, and to look at her, actually look at her, and not to trust what the family said without looking first. He had written a final line that she could only read once before she had to fold the letter away again, that he was sorry he could not protect her himself, and that he hoped Edmund would be quicker to understand than he feared the world would be. The letter had never reached Edmund. Someone had intercepted it, and she knew, without having to say it aloud, that Gerald had discovered the intention and had ensured the letter never left Ashmore Park. She had found it only because she had known to look in every drawer of the writing desk before she locked it away. She gathered the letters, all 43, and the 44th folded separately. She arranged them in their order by date, and she smoothed the envelopes, and she tied them with a piece of ribbon from the desk's small interior shelf, and she held them in both hands for a moment, and stood in the morning room in the thin November light. She did not send for Edmund. She did not ask permission. She walked down the corridor herself, carrying the letters, and she opened the library door, and Edmund was there, standing at the far end of the room with a document in his hand and a look on his face that told her he had received the same news she had. He turned when she entered. His gray eyes moved to the bundle in her hands. "You have received word," she said. "It was not a question." "This morning," he said, "I was not informed before the petition was filed. I want you to know that." She crossed the room and set the letters on the table between them without speaking. She untied the ribbon. She separated the last letter, the one with Francis's formal address in the upper corner, and she placed it before him. "This was written to you," she said. "It was intercepted. I believe Gerald found it in Francis's study before the household was fully transferred, and made a decision about its delivery." She looked at him steadily. "I am not asking you to believe me about anything else before you read it. I am only asking you to read it." He picked it up. He read slowly, and she watched his face, and she was reminded sharply of the way Francis had read things. He considered significant the very specific stillness of a man who is giving something his full attention. Edmund read the letter through once, and then he put it flat on the table with both hands, and stood looking at it for a long moment. "He wrote to me," Edmund said, in a voice she had not heard from him before, quieter, as though the words were arriving from somewhere much further back than the room. "3 weeks before he died," she said. "I believe he was afraid time was short." He was silent for another long moment. Then he said, still looking at the letter, "I signed the trusteeship order in February. I did not ask to meet you first. I signed it because the testimony was consistent and the petition was correctly filed. And I believed I was acting in your interest." He looked up. "I was not acting in your interest. I was acting inside a version of events that had been composed for me, and I did not question it sufficiently, and I am sorry." Cecily looked at him. She had been carrying this story alone for 11 months, and she had rehearsed, in the privacy of her own mind, a great number of things she might say to the first person who offered her an apology. None of them seemed adequate to the actual moment of it. "Read the rest of the letters," she said. "Then tell me whether you would like to question it sufficiently." Now Gerald arrived with Mr. Dingt. Dace, his solicitor, at 2 in the afternoon, and he arrived, expecting a formality. The new certificate was in order. Edmund had been appointed as trustee precisely because Gerald had anticipated a man who would manage the administrative details of his sister-in-law's removal without requiring persuasion. He had met Edmund twice before, years ago, and had remembered him as efficient and uncomplicated. He was not prepared for the library. Edmund stood at the head of the reading table, with 43 letters arranged before him in precise chronological order. And beside him stood Cecily, with her hands quietly folded and her back straight, wearing the expression of a woman who has been waiting a very long time to be in this room. The dowager came in behind Gerald, and Mr. Dace, and the family's physician, and a maid who had been brought as a witness to the Duchess's generally confused state. They arranged themselves in their established positions, in the usual expectation. But, Edmund said, I have reviewed the correspondence between the late Duke and Her Grace over the period of his illness, which spans approximately 14 months. The correspondence is complete, internally consistent, and demonstrates an active and lucid mind on the Duchess's part across the full period in question. He paused. I have also reviewed a letter from the late Duke addressed to me specifically, dated 3 weeks before his death, which was intercepted and did not reach me at the time of its composition. Gerald's expression did not change, but his hands stilled on his gloves. I intend to read this letter aloud, Edmund said, in the presence of all parties, because the Duke's instructions are specific, and they pertain to this house and to Her Grace's legal situation. Kinvale, Gerald began. I do not think. I did not ask, Edmund said. His voice was still level. It did not rise. It did not sharpen into cruelty. It simply stopped being willing to be interrupted. He read the letter from beginning to end, in the measured voice of a man who understood that the weight of the words required no assistance from his tone. The room was very quiet. The dowager's fan, which she had been turning in her hand, went still at the part where Francis wrote that he had watched his family misread his wife for the entirety of their marriage and had not known how to correct their certainty while he lived. She did not look up from the table. When Edmund finished reading, he folded the letter and set it down and looked directly at Gerald. The physician's certificate filed this morning is withdrawn, he said. My assessment as trustee does not support the petition for guardianship. The Duchess of Ashmore is in full possession of her faculties, and has been in full possession of her faculties throughout the period in question. He crossed to the side of the table where Cecily was standing. 3 steps, the kind of crossing that is also a declaration. And he said, into the silence that had settled over the room like snowfall, she is the Duchess of Ashmore. She always has been. The dowager's fan made a small sound against the table, the sound of something set down rather than dropped. Gerald looked at Mr. Dace, who looked at his own papers, and did not look up again. The physician took his certificate from his coat pocket, and folded it, and put it away. Cecily looked at the table. She looked at her own hands, which were folded in front of her, which were not shaking. She had thought they might shake, and they did not. She looked at the letters, all 43 of them, spread before the people who had spent 11 months arguing that she was not herself. And she thought of Francis, who had known her entirely, who had known this day would come, who had trusted the right man to come and look. She breathed once, slowly through her nose. The room began to empty around her. Gerald and Mr. Dace withdrew without ceremony. The physician followed. The maid who had been brought as a witness to her confusion slipped out the door without meeting her eyes. The dowager remained the longest, standing near the window with the composed expression of a woman recalibrating, and then she set her fan on the sill and left it there, which Cecily thought was, in its own way, as clear a statement as anything that had been said aloud. Edmund remained. He stood at the near end of the table and he looked at her across the letters, and he did not offer a speech. He offered her, instead, the simple fact of his continued presence in the room, which was a kind of statement she had not known how to hope for, and recognized, now that it was here, as precisely what she needed. Thank you, she said, and the words felt, after 11 months, almost unwieldy. Too small and too large at once. I should have come sooner, he said. "I should have asked to meet you before I signed anything." "You did not know," she said. "And you came now." He looked at her for a long moment. His face had changed since the morning, since before the letter. The particular quality of holding still that she had read initially as coldness had resolved into something else, something closer to the expression of a man who has been carrying something heavy for a long time. "What will you do now?" he asked. She looked at the open letters on the table. "I will put Francis's letters in order," she said. "I will see that the school in Keeling Village has what it requires for winter. I will begin reviewing the estate accounts for the year and determining what has been mismanaged in my absence from them." She looked up. "And I will open the curtains in the morning room." Something moved in Edmund's gray eyes, and he pressed his lips together for a moment, and she thought that if they had been different people in different circumstances, she might have laughed. And perhaps so might he. "The gray wool curtains," he said. "They are very unfortunate curtains," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I will be in London through December for the court formalities. The trusteeship must be formally vacated, which requires a filing and a brief hearing. I will come back in January to confirm that everything is correctly settled." She looked at him steadily. "That is not what I asked you," she said. He held her gaze. "No," he said after a moment. "It is not." She did not press him. She had learned, in the course of a very long and careful year, the difference between what a person was saying and what they were not yet ready to say but would, and she had learned more recently to be patient with the difference. She turned back to the letters and began to gather them into order. She heard him take a step toward the door, and then stop. "Her Grace," he said. She looked up. "Cecily," he said. The sound of her given name in his voice, the deliberate sound of it, the way he had reached for it rather than letting the formal address stand between them, settled in her the way that particular kind of warmth settles, all at once and quietly without preparation. "Edmund," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded, once, the nod of a man who has made a decision and is not going to unsay it, and he left her to her letters. By January, the curtains in the morning room had been replaced with something in a soft blue that she had chosen herself, and the looking-glass above the chimney-piece had been uncovered, and the writing desk stood open on its table, near the window where the winter light could reach it properly. No longer hidden, Edmund came back on the 17th of January, as the court filing required, arriving in the late afternoon when the light was already going low and gold against the park's bare trees. Cecily was at the writing desk when she heard his carriage on the gravel, and she did not close the desk or remove herself from the window. She stayed where she was, and she let him find her there. He came through the morning room doorway and stopped when he saw her, and she saw him take in the open desk, the light on the letters, the room remade into something that was properly hers again. He crossed to the near side of the desk. He did not take the chair opposite her. He stood and looked at the letters for a moment, and then he looked at her. "How have you been?" he asked, and the question was plain and specific, and meant exactly what it asked. "Well," she said. "I have been well." She looked at him in the winter light, at the silver scar through his left brow and the gray eyes and the set mouth that she had learned to read over the course of one very concentrated November, and she found to her careful surprise that she was glad he was here. Not relieved, not grateful, exactly. Glad, in the specific and quiet way that has nothing defensive in it. The key was still on its ribbon. She was still wearing it, not because she needed to anymore, but because she had not yet decided what to do with it. And because some habits of preservation survived the threat that made them necessary, and because it was, in the end, simply hers. She reached up and drew it from beneath her collar, and she held it in her open hand. And she looked at it for a moment. Then she set it on the top of the open desk beside the lamp where the light caught the worn iron of it. "I thought you might like to know what was in it," she said. Edmund looked at the key on the desk. He looked at the letters inside, all 43, and the 44th with his name still on the envelope. He looked at her. "I think," he said slowly, "that I already know what was in it, You know what the letters say, she said. That is not quite the same thing. He looked at her for a long moment in the winter light. No, he said after a moment. It is not. Alice knocked on the morning room door at 5 o'clock, as she had taken to doing since October, bringing the small doll she had taught to read through an entire winter of afternoon company. She looked at Edmund with the serious assessment of 8 years old, and then looked at Cecily, and seemed to make a decision that the situation was satisfactory. "Is the gentleman staying for tea?" she asked. Cecily looked at Edmund. Edmund looked at Cecily. "He is," Cecily said. The fire was lit. The late winter light moved long and golden across the writing desk, across the open letters, across the key, sitting beside the lamp where it caught the warmth and held it. The bare trees in the park stood in the still air of early evening, and the room was quiet in the particular way of rooms that have been restored to themselves, rooms that have survived what was done to them, and remain settled and warm, waiting only for the ordinary and good things that rooms are made for. Cecily looked at the open desk and did not press the key against her sternum. She folded her hands in her lap and felt, for the first time in longer than she could name with precision, that there was nothing left to protect, that the keeping was done, that the thing she had kept was out in the light now in the full sight of the room, as it had always deserved to be. She looked at Edmund, who had come back in January as he had said he would, and who was watching the fire rather than her, in the companionable, undemanding way of someone who is simply glad to be where he is. The desk sat open. The letters were at rest. If this story of Cecily's long, careful winter moved you in some small way, leave a word in the comments. Stories like this one are kept alive by the people who carry them forward. The key caught the firelight and held it, still and warm, in the open air.